There's a scene in this episode, you probably know the one I'm talking about, that made me go, what the... Episode 6, Rain, kicks off, well, in the pouring rain. A mailman delivers some items, including a letter for Leanne. He sees Jericho and politely says hi, but Dorothy gets oddly uncomfortable with this simple gesture and quickly takes Jericho away. Sean's flying out to cook for the Philadelphia Eagles and will be gone overnight. Before he goes, he asks Dorothy if she's been using his sumac, which she jokingly declines. I tried to look into the potential significance of sumac, but didn't find much that stood out. Leanne eventually opens her letter that just says, "Found you." There's some tension surrounding who the letter is from, but in the very next scene, Leanne's Uncle George arrives at the front door, so we can assume the letter was from him. Leanne appears unsettled by his arrival. She doesn't put up a fight letting him in, but does ask him to remove his shoes because Dorothy doesn't allow shoes in the house. Uncle George seems hesitant to do this, and I wondered why. Then I found this. "Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereupon thou standest is holy ground." Could it be that Uncle George is bothered by the suggestion that the Turner's house is somehow holy enough to warrant removing his shoes? Uncle George says he wants to have a proper look at Jericho. If Leanne hasn't been in contact with her uncle since she arrived at the Turners, this points to him knowing something about the child before Leanne got there. We'll touch on this more later. Dorothy returns home from work and finds Leanne's letter on the counter. She then spots strange shoes by the door and seeks out Leanne to find out what the hell is going on. In Leanne's room, she finds Leanne and Jericho, but is surprised to find the mysterious Uncle George there as well. The two have a somewhat awkward meeting before Uncle George presents her with the gift of the wooden chef for the baby's mobile. In our mid-season deep dive video, we mentioned this show's connection to the classic story of Pinocchio. The wooden chef appears to be yet another reference. I found it interesting that Uncle George chose the wording, "your husband," when describing the gift. Could this be a hint that Uncle George is actually the puppet master, controlling people in this story? Dorothy eventually invites Uncle George to stay for dinner. At the table, there's a tense moment when Uncle George grabs Dorothy's arm aggressively, but we soon learn that it's part of the connecting of hands for the dinner prayer. Thanks Redditor Wikimandia for pointing out that the prayer sounds like it's the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, which was the language commonly believed to be spoken by Jesus and his disciples. Uncle George says that he works in salvage. When Dorothy asks if he salvages ships, he answers, "Sometimes." This is an interesting notion. It's safe to assume salvage has a deeper meaning here. Does this hint that Uncle George helps to salvage relationships? That he somehow has the divine purpose of helping those struck by tragedy and thus salvaging the family? He tells Dorothy that there have been some issues back home and Leanne will be needed there. Dorothy is upset by this, but before they discuss it much further, Julian arrives, clearly sent by Sean to investigate Uncle George. When Jericho cries, Dorothy leaves the table to attend him, and Julian wastes no time asking Uncle George who he really is. I found Uncle George's words to be very interesting. He says, "Uncles, it's a greater responsibility than people realize. In the event of tragedy, that's when we step up. Take the child under our wing, if we're good people." We are both good people, aren't we, Julian? Could Uncle George and the Aunt May that we hear about briefly later have taken Leanne in and raised her following the Grayson house fire? That still doesn't explain the grave of Leanne Grayson, though. Following the dinner, Julian calls Sean and says he's pretty sure Uncle George is behind everything that's been going on since Leanne arrived. This calls back to the idea that Uncle George could play the role of puppet master, or at least be directly involved with why Leanne was there in the first place. Dorothy invites Uncle George to spend the night instead of him finding a room somewhere else. Julian also stays to keep an eye on things. Dorothy confides in Julian about how she's upset that Uncle George would suggest that their home isn't suitable for Leanne, and she's adamant that she wants Leanne to stay, despite Julian's disagreement. The scene where Uncle George knows that Dorothy's mother was dead is very interesting. How does he know this? And why was he not hesitant to call her Dottie? It's like he somehow knew this was the nickname that Dorothy's mother used for her. In the night, Julian wakes to a noise and finds that Uncle George is no longer on the couch. He searches most of the home but can't find him. He eventually tells Dorothy, and the two debate on what they should do. Eventually, they hear Jericho crying and find him on the floor of the nursery. This scene, what the hell? Uncle George is found sleeping in the crib, I laughed so hard at this, but was also so confused. Why on earth was he in that crib? Was it because the cross was hanging above it? What's the significance of all this? Some people online believe that the baby was thrown on the floor, but I don't think this was the case. Jericho doesn't cry for a long time following the initial noise that woke Julian up. If he was tossed onto the floor, wouldn't he have started wailing right away? The following morning, Dorothy's trying hard to look the part of a staunch religious woman. She even initiates the joining of hands for prayer at breakfast. There's a few shots with interesting lighting choices throughout this episode, almost like they're trying to show us that Dorothy has seen the light. Leanne pleads her case against her uncle and decides to stay with the Turners, despite her uncle's disagreement. He says, "What about the others, the ones who deserve your help? Will you abandon them for this? For her?" This ties into my personal theory, that Leanne has the divine ability of miracles that include resurrecting a child. Uncle George believes the Turners have a godless house, and seems to suggest that there are others in the world much more deserving of Leanne's gift. I really enjoyed this episode and found it to be another strong entry to the season. While it gave us more pieces of the puzzle, including some of Leanne's backstory, it also left us with a ton of questions, which has come to be the norm. I love the humor that sneaks into this dark show. The camera work is also excellent. Mike Giolakis is fast becoming one of my favorite cinematographers in this genre. I love the way he positions shots and the way he moves the camera throughout a scene. I'll give this episode an A-. It's hard to get to everything in these videos, so leave us a comment and let us know if we missed anything important. What did you think of the crib moment? What do you think it means? Let us know below. If you've enjoyed this video, we'd love for you to subscribe to see all of our content going forward. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.